Thank you, everyone. I am Sarah Emond. For those who weren't here for the first part of the meeting, I have the great privilege of being the president and CEO of ICER. And what we're going to spend the next 90 minutes doing is talking about a lot and pulling on some of the threads of the conversation that we've heard throughout the day about this new therapy for this serious condition. Before I ask the policy roundtable members to introduce themselves, I want to tell you a little bit about where we're going to go. We're going to reflect on the votes that we just had, the themes that came up in the conversation, and we're going to try and chart a path forward to support affordable access. For those who listened to the introduction of the meeting today, I am really worried about the affordability of our healthcare system. And I believe strongly that everybody has a responsibility to be actively working on making things more affordable. And I do want to say that I'm personally disappointed that the manufacturer isn't here, because right now is such a critical time for our healthcare system, and affordability and access have never been more in jeopardy. All stakeholders have a social obligation to be part of solutions-oriented discussions about improving access and affordability. And the organization picking a price to charge society for this medicine should be here for these discussions, justifying their price and committing to affordable access for patients. We all want this innovation to be available. We're going to talk about the magnitude of benefit. You heard what the CTAF voted in terms of, is the evidence adequate to say this is better than usual care? Yes. You heard them talk about the other benefits and contextual considerations, the ethical priorities we have to members of our community with this condition. And you also heard them universally call this low value simply because of the price chosen by the manufacturer. Prices out of line with the value that they provide to patients harm affordability and access. And I am probably going to say that so much in the next 90 minutes that you're going to be sick of hearing it, but here we are. With that out of the way, I am so thrilled to have the members of the Policy Roundtable with us today. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, a little bit about their role, and then we're going to get into some conversation about the votes. Health equity is going to be a part of our conversation today. We're going to talk about coverage policy. We're going to talk about pricing. And then to tell all of my fellow Policy Roundtable members now, be thinking now, you get to tell someone to do something at the end. You have a call to action. If you could ask one person in the ecosystem to do something differently to improve access and affordability for this new therapy, what would it be? So you can start thinking of that now. Vicki, thanks for being here. Why don't you say hello?
Thank you, Sarah. Pleasure to be here. My name is Vicki Brown. I am our Associate Vice President at Humana Pharmacy Solutions for our clinical drug strategies, and I have responsibility for how we consider formulary management for both pharmacy and medical drugs.
Thank you, Vicki. Dr. Paul Diefenbach.
Hello. My name's Paul Diefenbach. I'm an associate physician and at Brigham and Women's Hospital and instructor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. I also work for UpToDate as an in-house senior physician editor, covering pulmonary topics, including bronchiectasis. I don't have any conflicts to disclose.
Yes, thank you. And Vicki, any updates to your disclosures besides being a Humana employee?
No updates.
Thank you, Vicki. Amy, why don't you say hi?
Hi, I'm Amy Liebman. I'm president of NTM Info and Research. We're a patient advocacy group for patients with NTM, bronchiectasis, and other comorbid diseases that are related. To update my disclosures, I was asked to indicate that INSMED is one of the funders for NTM Info and Research. I have no other updates to my disclosures. Thank you for having
so
me
much.
here.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Amy. Thank you so much. John.
I'm John Torrance. I've been a bronchiectasis and NTM patient for 16 years. I've had every possible treatment, including oral, inhaled, intravenous drugs. I've had surgery. I've had major lifestyle changes. So I've been living the dream. I've been a involved with or paid for, sorry, I've been paid by the Bronchiectasis and NTM Association to work with patients over the last 6 years and help them get to a sustainable position. I also volunteer with Amy's group.
Wonderful, John, thank you. And Emily.
Hello, my name is Emily Shao. I am a senior clinical pharmacist. I oversee drug trend management at Primera Blue Cross, and I have no other conflicts of interest to disclose.
Thank you, Emily. We like to start this part of the conversation by focusing on health equity. And so in this case, and you heard the conversation, many of you heard the conversation during the votes about whether there's some special, if this condition is of special interest to those of racial and ethnic backgrounds. And it was kind of a hard conversation to have because this, like many conditions that have a component of being mis or underdiagnosed, we know disproportionately impact those who've been historically disadvantaged by the healthcare system. And even though we don't have data for that, we all kind of like feel it in our gut. And so I would love to start, actually, Amy, I'd love to start with you. Given the support groups that you're running and what you're seeing out there, you talked a lot about some of the communities that were surfacing that weren't really on the radar for having this condition, and there's such a need for that. What health equity issues are on your radar for you and your organization?
So, when the pandemic hit and everything pivoted to online, um, our support groups started meeting online. And I think one of the things that we started to see was, whereas our support groups were very immediately focused geographically before, like it was one smaller area, they now encompass larger areas. So we are seeing more of the rural, very suburban areas where they aren't necessarily close to a center of excellence. We're seeing more of these patients come into our support groups now, which is great. And some of them are being, they're finding us because they're being diagnosed by a doctor who's in their community, who happens to know what they're doing. Some of them are being diagnosed because they found our website. They were looking up their symptoms online and they found our website and they were reading about it and they went and asked questions. But one way or another, they find their way to us. All of our discussion in our patient forum, our support groups, is science-based. So we don't have discussions about, alternative medicine in there. Our attitude about that is if it works for you, that's great, but we talk about it, the actual treatments that are, used and prescribed. So these patients, a lot of them come in, they don't know about airway clearance or anything like that. And it's one of the first things they ever learn about is how they deal with, pulmonary hygiene. Um, and so that gives them some access to information and guidance that they wouldn't necessarily get normally. So we're seeing a lot more of that now. Um, I mentioned that we do a patient conference every year. One of the things we do at our patient conference is we give out some patient scholarships. These are for people who could not afford to come to the conference otherwise because it's in a specific geographic location. It is a hybrid conference, and there are some people who literally cannot even afford, we charge a minimal fee for patients in general. Some people can't even afford the, online registration. That's fine. We will comp them that registration too. We try to make sure that there's as much access as possible. Um, that's one of the things that has shaken out. But, as I said, for years and years, living in Miami, I was just like, you cannot possibly tell me that there are no Hispanic patients. It's not possible. And sure enough, there are lots of Hispanic patients, and they are now coming out of the woodwork. And the thing that we have found with these patients is that, like, you know, it'll be like, oh, I've been diagnosed with this. And then it's like, you'll never believe this, but this woman who lives 2 blocks over from me was diagnosed with this. And we've actually had that happen to some of our patients as well. One woman, 4 people in her neighborhood, all diagnosed with it. My parents walked in to have lunch one day and this woman was like, "Oh yeah, I was diagnosed with MAC." Like she's the sister of a friend kind of thing. It's sort of like, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon with these kinds of
Mhm.
things. It
Right.
just kind of like you fall into it.
Yeah.
So they just kind of keep coming out of the woodwork.
Yeah.
And we see the demographics shifting also at our conference. Like we see the people who are registering, the people who are registering for our webinars, people who are coming to our support group meetings now. We're seeing that shift in demographics. The fact that we have a men's group I think they're on like meeting number 2 or something, and they already have like, oh, sorry, meeting number 3, my bad. And they already have like more than 24 members,
Right.
probably closer to 36. That tells me something else as well. You know, don't discount men as an underserved population in a disease that has historically been thought of as a women's disease, something that mostly women get. So yeah,
Gives
my
you a great
attitude
point.
is we're going to keep looking for them
Yeah.
and finding them.
And I think it's such an important reminder of the role that voluntary health organizations, patient advocacy organizations can play in the entire ecosystem. Whereas, you know, perhaps the academic medical center doesn't have the resources to be thinking about that sort of outreach, et cetera. Who knows? And the community-based ones, as we talked about a lot today, are dealing with a lot of things. They're generalists. They're not necessarily looking for this. And so thank you for your work. John, I'm going to pivot to you, but one of the other things I wanted to sort of tee you up for is that I think we all talk about the things that really weren't fun about COVID, but I think the sort of virtual piece of this for patients has not been emphasized enough. And I don't know if all of your, support groups are now virtual or how that's working, but that rural urban divide can really be closed. And even with some telehealth, which we'll talk about, but what health equity issues are you hearing about from your communities, from the support groups that you're running? What do you want us to have in our heads as we think about solutions?
Oh, thank you for the question. Certainly the Zoom mindset opened up a much larger group to be able to have access to it. I still think there's still a group that is not technologically savvy, or maybe
Yes.
doesn't have internet access, doesn't get that whole thing, that we're still missing that group. I'd like to go back a little bit to Amy's comment. Within this disease space, the early providers even came up with a model of what a patient was to be called. It was the Lady Windermere syndrome, because there were so many patients that looked like the older Caucasian female, that they gave it that classification. And I have to be very careful. Please don't interpret anything I say as racially insensitive, but that's one particular group. But that group is fairly assertive about their care, and they rise to the occasion and get it. I spent a lot of time working in Mexico when I was young, and I was around, and I've been around a lot of Hispanic people. These are very hardworking people that don't have an economic basis. When a Mexican woman who cleans houses gets sick, she doesn't go to a pulmonologist, she goes to work, because those are her choices. So
Right.
we're not, as Amy says, we're not seeing a group, not because they're not sick, but because they don't feel they have access to this. And when they do go to a doctor, that doctor is poorly informed. So yes, the Zoom mentality opened up a certain portion of the population, but I really fear that we're missing another part of the population.
When we have these conversations for other diseases, we talked about secondary progressive multiple sclerosis earlier this year. We've talked about acute pain, which is we've had so many times where this theme has come up. The structural problems with our healthcare system are so hard for us to overcome on our own. And so as we think about solutions oriented things, whether it's the access, the affordability, the diagnosis, the telehealth, we'll keep in mind that we can't blow up the entire healthcare system and start over, at least not right now. I don't know where we're headed, but that this is the type of acknowledgement that is, even if that vote earlier about the sort of special priorities for racial and ethnic populations, it's just that, yes, always there are those underserved by the system because the system is not designed to serve those who are underserved. I didn't mean for that to be as circular as it sounded, but here we are. Paul, in your clinic, you're in an academic medical center. I'm not putting you on the spot to be like everything's perfect there, but I know you absolutely are dealing with disparities in access and delays in diagnosis. What are some of the things that you've seen working, or things that you wish were working a little bit more on the health equity side for this particular population?
Yeah, I think it it does work a little bit better in an academic medical center, but still, there's a lot of barriers to getting frankly, all sorts of different care. But the prescriptions, there's like a key thing, but home medical equipment and therapies is definitely difficult. So trying to get somebody a percussion vest, trying to set someone up to get chest physiotherapy at home, or be taught how to get chest physiotherapy at home. Nebulizers, in the pandemic, and even since, there have been weird shortages of saline of different concentrations for nebulizers in ways that are very frustrating. And even, in our centers, you send something off to a pharmacy of a given dose, and having that come back to you that no, we can't, or to, if you're going through Medicare Part B, and having it come back to you that like, nope, that's on severe shortage and can't be delivered. It's not smooth. Inhaled medications for this disease sometimes need special nebulizer machines, not the standard nebulizer machine, depending on which inhaled antibiotic you're talking about. So I think there's a lot of structural barriers towards delivering all of these kinds of things that patients need, and patients that aren't on top of it and advocating for themselves and letting me know what isn't happening so that I can work on it through all the back channels will just not get what they need in a reasonable period of time. It's very challenging, and I'm sure it's one of the things that John and Amy's groups help patients to do, is to advocate and jump through the hoops to have many of these things happen. So that's the kind of thing that comes top of mind. And then obviously secondarily, our clinics have 6-month to 1 year long wait lists, and and people can have a lot of exacerbations in that period of time, and getting people access to care in a timely manner is a huge problem, even in places with lots of medical care.
We'll get back to sort of physician access and shortages, because I do want to talk about sort of telehealth and sort of the urban-rural divide, or maybe it's just the urban-urban divide, because those of us still living in urban areas are having long wait times. But Amy, come in on this, please.
Yes, I just wanted to follow up on what Dr. Diefenbach said. He was commenting on how he doesn't hear from patients sometimes. There are a million things that also doctors, like there are a million hurdles that doctors have to jump through as well to get things done for their patients. They have to go through a lot of work. There's like prior authorizations and paperwork, and then if there's an appeal that has to be done. I mean, I've sat in my doctor's office and watched them, fill out the paperwork for a prior authorization for something for me, and I'm like, I don't know, are you writing War and Peace? Like, what are you doing? It's like, and so, and that's just for something simple like migraines. Compound that now to something very complex and chronic, like bronchiectasis. But that's just one facet. Like there are a million little things that sort of contribute to this overall, like this overwhelming need to look at what are the things that are broken or that need fixing, at least with the healthcare system, that are causing or adding to the burden of cost. I guess we're not going to even touch on the issue of executive compensation.
I love that you put it on the table though, Amy. So thank you.
$15.6 million just for one. I'm just saying, it's, got to put it, if we're going to have the conversation, we should have we should at least acknowledge that elephant in the room.
I was recently on a panel where we were talking about drug pricing policy and the challenges that we have. And I said, listen, if we started from the patient experience and worked backwards, we never would have designed the system this way. And I think most of us can acknowledge that. And so we're going to try and stay as solution oriented as we can today, because believe it or not, people read our policy recommendations when they come out. And so we want to be able to say, like, here's what we want the payers to do. Here's what we need the academic medical centers to do. Here's where patients can really drive education for access and affordability. So let's all try and keep that energy together. Amy, did you want to come back in on that? I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, I just also wanted to add, one of the things we do with our patients is we do try to help them advocate for themselves. Like there are times where sometimes somebody in our support group will say, I don't even know how to talk to my dog. I don't know how to bring this up. They will role play with them sometimes and teach them like, this is what you need to tell them and this is how you can word it. The problem sometimes that happens with patients and with the healthcare system is sometimes when a patient says, no, 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 I really need you to hear me. No, this is what I need. They will get labeled as like a difficult patient or a non-compliant patient. And it's like, that's not always the case,
Right.
So
Right.
I think that there's just like a lot of room for improvement in terms of how the communication is going on. And I think that there needs to be a mind shift in terms of when you hear a patient saying, no, 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 I need you to listen to me because I have a need that's not being met, that we need to stop thinking about that as a difficult patient and start thinking about that as you are not hearing a patient when they are telling you that there's something wrong.
Thank you, Amy. I wanted to just pick up on the telehealth piece just quickly, because sometimes this does come up in our recommendations. So we heard today that delays in diagnosis, community pulmonologists, not a lot of familiarity with this condition. And so it's got to be somebody with specific training. Paul, I'm going to go to you first. What are you hearing about in your community to bridge this gap? Is there leadership from the clinical societies? Are there telehealth consultations? You've got two payers here. You can tell them, I would love to do more telehealth, but I have trouble getting prior auth, whatever it is. Is there something on this telehealth piece? I just want to make sure we had a moment to talk about it that is working, not working, that you think could be better.
Yeah, I think I think there's people with bronchiectasis that present very classically that are bringing up large amounts of sputum in high volume, and that's their presentation, and they're doing it daily, and that's their presentation. And I think that specific phenotype is in a non-smoker especially is going to be relatively high in the minds of even community pulmonologists for the most part. The problem is that does not represent the full spectrum of people with bronchiectasis, and people that are presenting with a more non-productive cough, certainly people that are presenting with fever, fatigue, some of the stuff John was talking about with less prominent respiratory, or certainly less prominent mucus production. It's going to be more difficult to diagnose it until there's a CT scan. And then often I think people are stuck in it's mentioned on CT scan, but they either don't see a pulmonologist or something else is distracting. It's in a hospitalization or an ER visit and they're just treating the pneumonia. I do think the idea of, if bronchiectasis is mentioned prominently on a radiographic read of a CT scan gotten for any other reason, it would be really nice to get that scan in front of a pulmonologist, like the actual images, to figure out, is bronchiectasis sort of systemic, somewhat widespread bronchiectasis a really important component of what's going on in this patient? Or, as we sort of heard a little bit earlier today, sometimes somebody with asthma or COPD or something else has a couple of very small areas of bronchiectasis on their scan that are unlikely to be clinically relevant. You would need to really talk to the patient to be 100% certain of that, but are less likely to be clinically relevant, compared with if somebody has tree and bud opacities everywhere and even relatively minor, but lots of tree and bud and a little bit of bronchiectasis. That could be a very severe MAC that needs treatment.
So what I'm hearing from that, Paul, is that when we are thinking about care pathways, not just in the pulmonologist office, but the entire continuum of care, someone's getting imaging, that systems have ways to flag keywords, diagnoses, et cetera, to make sure that they're getting into their pathway so that it doesn't then rely on the patient being the one that has to sort of advocate, understand, and figure it out. And so we can work that into some of our recommendations. Thank you. John, you've been waiting patiently, please.
Sarah, thank you. And you pointed out there's two payers on the screen, so please indulge me for just a moment. There was significant discussion earlier about the significant cost of this new medicine that's coming out and its potential low value for money. The opposite end of the spectrum is that every patient in the bronchiectasis world needs to do the airway clearance. We've heard that repeatedly. And yet, Amy and I can both attest that new patients coming into the system will either be told they don't need a nebulizer or just get one on Amazon or go watch a YouTube video. And I promise you, there is no way a patient can understand the true action of airway clearance by getting it remotely from a third party or reading a piece of paper. So payers, please, we need an appointment with a respiratory therapist. We need a full session where that respiratory therapist gives us a full lesson in how to go through the process. And we need a phone call 30 days later, because I promise you we missed half of those instructions. That's my prayer. Thank you.
John, you jumped the gun. You got to tell them what to do at the end. So now you get a second one at the end. You can tell them what to do. Vicki and Emily haven't had a chance to chime in. I see you, Amy. I'm going to get to you in a second. But Vicki, please react. And then I was going to ask you a few follow-up questions on John's points.
Yeah, thank you, John. I really appreciate your points. And as I was preparing for this, one of the key things I want to do is really applaud ICER for the incorporation of how systematically you looked at the patient experience for this disease, because this is a new and novel treatment in a disease where we don't have other agents. Like we've said that time and time again today. So the things that you're talking about, the supportive care and whatnot, but in the umbrella of this disease, there's a lot of learning, I think, that we're honestly still doing. So what you just said strongly resonates and resonated with me as I was preparing to be here today. And I would just remind everyone, as Humana, we're offering primarily government programs. So you can think about 6 million Medicare Advantage members, about 2 million PDP members, and about 1.5 million Medicaid beneficiaries. And I keep thinking
PDP
about
is prescription drug plan for those who
Thank
don't
you.
know.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Got ahead of myself. Thank you. And as I think about those individuals, as I think about seniors and individuals with disabilities and how they're trying to navigate and all these different components, it really is overwhelming when you think about that navigation piece. And so the specifics, I think, John, that you just called out are really helpful, because as an integrated healthcare company, we're trying to think about not just the drug, but what are the other things that that person needs access to be able to be most successful in their care. Because 9 times out of 10, it is not just the drug. It is the 10 other things that are needed to support that member. So I strongly appreciate your comments. I took some notes here because I really think that that is a dialogue that has been really fruitful today around the lived experience of this drug, not just the patient and not just the drug, and really more amplifying what your total needs are. So thank you.
Vicki, one of the things before I go to Emily is that the ICER often is looking at drugs that are the first thing for the disease. That's because we are interested in questions of, the price that reflects the benefit the patient's receiving, the innovation signal that we're sending back to the ecosystem in order to develop drugs like this. And one of the things that we continually learn is how attention to the disease, because a drug is approved, impacts a whole bunch of other parts of the disease care journey, because it just had been kind of underappreciated because there wasn't a lot of good therapies out there. And so we can all hope that this is the beginning of, and I think Dr. Exmet, who's with us earlier, made this point about like more innovation in this space because we've got a first mover. And what does that mean for future innovation? Drugs hopefully working a lot better for patients than this one. And then the entire ecosystem, because then it's the community oncologist knows more about bronchiectasis and understands how to order the right chest pressure percussion vest, and then we're making progress. But Emily, anything you wanted to say to John's point before I go back to Amy?
No, I think the conversation just recalled maybe some recommendations that from a commercial payer, one might think about. So I represent roughly 2 million lives on the medical benefit for commercial plan, and roughly 1 million on the pharmacy benefit. And when I was listening to this conversation, what I was thinking of is this is a really great opportunity to educate the employers on this condition, which I would be very surprised if they've ever really, had any sort of briefing on this condition, on, what it means for patients to have this new treatment, and also, the whole spectrum of care that is required to get patients to an optimal place. And so I guess from my perspective, I think of payers taking the opportunity to provide education on this to the employers. Typically there is, a minimum like email conversations that happen with the leaders of the employer group, or, meetings if you're a larger employer group. And then I also think about the opportunity to provide education to the providers. Typically, there's maybe like a quarterly meeting that is optional that providers can attend. There's newsletters that go out to the distribution list that we have. And I just feel like this is maybe one of those opportunities to really utilize this new approval to educate across the whole condition.
I appreciate you sharing that sometimes the payer has a role in that education. So your clients are the employers that are paying for the health insurance, and isn't it worth them understanding some of these new conditions, these new treatments, and then the whole pathway of care? Thank you, Emily. Amy, you've been very patient. Before we shift to talk about the votes, please come on in.
Sure, thanks. So first of all, John, you are wildly optimistic when you say that it's just that they haven't been given airway clearance. We have patients coming into the support group system who haven't even heard of airway clearance, and they're getting their education from the old time members. The newbies are coming in. But I wanted to address a couple of points. This is like, for this particular drug, it's not a short-term treatment. This is something that if a patient is going to be put on this, they're going to be on it for the longer term because they have an inflammatory condition that's not calming down. So, the idea is to reduce the exacerbations, reduce, the inflammation and the destruction over time. It is the first treatment for this disease, so I'm not sure how thorough an evaluation anybody can do because we're just at the start of this journey. It's very hard to do an assessment of value. Um, from our perspective, it's incredibly valuable because this is something that the patients have asked for specifically and they want. And they recognize it as something that addresses something in their condition that they have experienced over and over again as being a significant issue. But this isn't for something with, related to if somebody has asthma or COPD, that's not what this drug is for. It's not for the non-exacerbators. It's for the people who have more frequent exacerbations. Those people are going to have a higher burden of care, a higher burden of cost of care. They're going to have more issues come up more often. And again, in terms of cost and effectiveness, and somebody mentioned Medicare. Medicare is covering treatments for cancer that literally have not been proven to be effective at all. And so if we're going to have a conversation about the whole ecosystem of the healthcare and the burden of cost to it, and these go back to conversations that patients end up having to have. And I saw, my stepmom having to have that conversation at the end of her life. Like, is this something I want to continue doing? So do you want to try a treatment that has no proven benefit? This treatment actually does have a proven benefit to a specific target population. Does it work for every single, target population, member of the population? No. But, that's been the same with a lot of other treatments. That's why you start developing it and then you go forward from there.
Amy, you've touched on a couple of things we're going to pick up through the conversation. So let's just shift a bit right now to the votes that we had. I want to hear reactions, positive, negative, context that you want us to have as we reflect back what we learned from the deliberation from the CTAF and how they thought about things. So to quickly review, a unanimous vote that this drug offers a net health benefit for patients. And so that means it is better for patients adding this care on to usual care. And I think that goes to the strength of the evidence from the well-designed trial. It speaks to exacerbations being something that patients and clinicians care about and care about controlling for all of the reasons we talked about a lot today. What we didn't ask in that question was the magnitude of that benefit, right? So what we heard in the conversation is a little bit better. It helps a little. And it's not the home run that I think patients were hoping for. Not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes the first entrant in a new condition offers incremental benefit. But why we got a unanimous vote of low long-term value, just to sort of give some context for those who aren't as familiar with our process. This is not a judgment of the patients. This is not a judgment of the condition. This is a judgment of the price picked by the manufacturer. And so that's what the CTAF vote was really reflecting for us, is that they believe, and our analysis showed this, that this was an overreach on price given the benefit they've been able to prove so far. And Amy's 100% correct. We're early, and we expect to have real-world evidence and data that will help us answer questions. But INSMED's asking society to pay for this now with the data that they've produced now. So I wanted that context, but John, I saw your hand go up and come down, and I'm going to pick on you anyway. Just as we think about what we heard today, on the clinical side, unanimous. This works better for patients than what we're already doing. And then unanimous on the value side that said, wow, this is an overreach on price from the manufacturer. Go ahead, John.
Okay, I'm not an economist and I'm not a scientist.
That's okay. Neither am I. I just play one on TV. So go ahead.
Okay, I was self-employed for 50 years, so I kind of had to work my way through the world. One thing that I've learned, okay, and this study, it's a year-long study of 1,700 people. That's a moment in time. So that's not the way this medicine will be used. Of those 1,700 people, maybe some got great effect from it, and maybe some didn't. The ones who didn't are not going to continue on the medicine. The ones who did get great benefit will continue. So the numbers change when you do it longitudinally, and you start saying this particular group gets a benefit from it. So the rate, in other words, the rate of change changes over time. You get the effect of your actions and then you modify. It's not like you make a decision one time and you go on forever.
That point's well taken.
And the other side is there are other drugs in development that will be competition to this. So, and I'm not familiar with what other drugs cost, but in my world, when other drugs come out, prices, again, will change to meet that market. The question is this a place to start? Is it worth having this drug out there so an initial group can get started and we'll play it by ear? If it turns out in the future that's not a fair price, again, can it be revisited? I don't know how that economy works. I will tell you, but for the value to the patient, and you had mentioned this Zoom economy that we got into with COVID. The other side of the Zoom economy and the COVID mentality is we normalized isolation for 4 years. We told people it was okay to stay in your house and no longer socialize. And Amy can attest to this. A great part of our patient population had a very hard time leaving the house 3-4 years after COVID because they were so used to this isolation. You heard it from some of the patients today. If this medicine gets them to where they're feeling better, it may be the magic pill that gives them that assertiveness to be re-engaged, to go see the grandchildren and go, tour or whatever. So there's other value beyond economic.
There absolutely is. And that's why we have the conversations of the benefits beyond health and the special ethical priorities. Because when people like Vicky and Emily are making decisions, they're not relying only on an ICER analysis or on the cost effectiveness model. That's one input into a decision that's made about the access. And I'm going to tee Emily and Vicky up for a moment of, are there already things you're thinking about that would accelerate access, get the data on who it's working for, who it's not, ways that like outcomes-based contracts, other approaches to access? And so think on that while I go to Paul and then to Amy. Amy, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just to two things to follow on John's point. Not only did patients have a hard time leaving the house, um, to be honest with you, when the pandemic started, they had the easiest time staying in because this is something they were already familiar with. This is a patient population that, when the flu season started, they were already used to adapting their behaviors to avoid getting sick. And I mean, my family was used to doing that to help protect my stepmom. So it was like, kind of like the Generation X battle cry. We were born for this, stay on the couch kind of thing. Yeah, our patient population is like, cool, cool. Yeah, no, we'll do this. We'll stay home. And then for them, it was like, yeah, why should we go out and get sick again? I kind of feel the same way. I got to be perfectly honest with you. There are
Yeah.
times where I go outside and I'm like, it's very peoply out there. I just
Mhm.
want to turn around and go back in.
Mhm. Mhm.
But also, the other point that was brought up is that there's a lot of information that's lacking that makes it very hard to make this kind of assessment. And, there are things like, cost burdens that aren't necessarily being considered, including like the cost burden of the caregivers. Will it make it easier for the caregivers to go out and live their life? I, as a caregiver, I could honestly say yes. But in terms of the healthcare cost, I gave you two concrete examples
Yeah.
of where it absolutely would have helped because
Yeah.
there were two caregivers whose health absolutely suffered. I mean,
Yeah.
my dad had a hospitalization because of it. So those are additional costs, and there's no way we're the only ones who are dealing with that.
Right.
This is like it's like a fallout effect. So
It's,
we have no way of measuring that right now. And
it's
like you said, we're just at the start of this.
we're
I'm
at
not
the start.
sure how complete an assessment we can make right now.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, we're committed to always doing what we call the modified societal perspective for just that point. Even when we don't have a ton of data, we have methods for imputing data and make sure we understand where the potential is to impact caregivers' health, caregivers' productivity, and all of these other aspects of value that you wouldn't necessarily see only in a health system perspective. So thank you for that point, Amy. Paul, please go ahead.
Unmuting. All right. Yeah. Actually, I was going to start kind of where Dr. Lee's question was leading, which is,
Actually, Paul, please like illuminate. Not everyone can
oh,
see the
sure,
chat. So if
sure,
you
sure,
want to
sure,
just repeat, that'd
sure.
be great. Thank you.
This is more about kind of what kind of diagnosis is non-cystic fibrosis bronchiectasis? Is it a single disease or not? And I think this is a very heterogeneous population, and there's certainly the possibility that they react somewhat heterogeneously to this drug. I do suspect that if Insmed had found a population that was really slam dunk that they could easily identify in their data, they probably would have tried to present that. But I do know that others, both for the not the history of this drug, but other drugs in its class that have been studied specifically in China and Japan and Asia, there seems to be a stronger effect out there than it is here. That probably has to do with what kinds of bronchiectasis, what the underlying etiologies of bronchiectasis are in those countries. Most likely, there's a chance that it's some kind of pharmacogenomic effect as well through certain HLA types or something along those lines, and that really hasn't been sorted out. But that's to say that I do think additional research might illuminate what kinds of people with with bronchiectasis in terms of etiology are most likely to benefit. The reason that it gets lumped all together is that there's certainly an end stage disease. There's lung that's been destroyed by recurrent chronic infections. There's chronic Pseudomonas and other infections that are there. These patients look very similar in the latest stages of disease, but the underlying reason that they're prone to recurrent infections is highly different, often immunologic, but highly different mechanisms. And so it is something to try to balance, especially when they're pricing this drug so high, is who are the people that are most likely to benefit. From my clinical perspective, what I have from this group, there's nothing that jumps out for sure. What I have is that it seems to be reducing exacerbations a little bit. And so I would have a tendency to be most interested in using this drug in patients with the most exacerbations, the most severe exacerbations, who had the most negative side effects from every exacerbation they've ever had, would be the kind of patient that I'd be thinking about as most likely to get a benefit from the limited data that we have so far.
That's a perfect tee up, Paul. Thank you for sort of now going to Emily and Vicky. Now we're going to talk about coverage policy. And so we can all have lots of thoughts and feelings about coverage policy and prior auth and all of the things, but we know that that is a part of the system to ensure that there are clinically appropriate prescribing happening for the most appropriate patient. We at ICER actually developed criteria, the cornerstones for fair access, to actually say this is what a coverage policy would need to look like in order to be reflective of the ethical considerations about fair access to drugs, right? 15 steps before getting a drug, not fair. All right. So we've written some of that down. And so we can kind of bring in some of the things that we've learned about how to do an evidence-based coverage policy, and all acknowledge that in a perfect system, we wouldn't need it. But again, if we were starting from the patient experience and working backwards, we wouldn't have come up with this, but this is where we are. Vicky and Emily, I'm going to go to you. Where are you guys in thinking about the coverage policy for this drug? It's been out for a couple of weeks. Is it still in development? How are you thinking about the aspects of the clinical evidence, the cost effectiveness, and how that's translating into a coverage policy? Vicky, to you first.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, I think we are still in the process of determining our coverage policy and our formulary placement for this medication. And so what I would say is we stay grounded in our clinical process. And so first and foremost, we're going to put the patient at the center of what we do, which hopefully ties back to the comments I made before of all the information today is extremely important to helping us understand the patient experience and the needs of this particular patient population. So as we think about that, our mission is really to ensure that we've got the right outcome for the right member at the right time, at the right cost. That's a lot of rights that we're trying to care for. Where we're going to start with is the clinical efficacy and the medication safety. We do that by, and this is the same for any drug, it is not unique to this drug, but we're first going to review the scientific literature. What is the evidence that led to FDA approval of a new medication? And then what is really helpful to us is when there are expert clinical guidelines available, because there is this larger context of the disease that the drug needs to then operate in that is oftentimes missing in the primary literature compared to what you can get when you then have clinical guidelines to be able to help understand like what's the broader context for these patients and the broader things that they need to be successful on this drug in terms of wraparound therapies. So I'll say that's absent today when we think about this medication, and would be very helpful in terms of guiding our P&T process, our Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee. After we've looked at all that evidence, after we understand the expert opinion, the expert guidelines, then we will determine from an affordability and access standpoint how we then balance all of these things in one place. It's not an easy job. And that's what we're trying to do. So once we start with the clinicals, we will then also then engage our drug manufacturer partners to be able to negotiate the lower cost for those medications based on what we've seen in terms of that clinical evidence and what the other market input factors are. Certainly ICER being a key component of that. And our intention then is to be able to reduce costs for the overall Medicare Part D program. That's our charge. And so we're starting with the clinical evidence and working to, is there a way to negotiate to the best possible cost in order to meet the needs of as many individuals as possible?
Vicki, educate this audience. How quickly are you trying to get the policy out after FDA approval?
So it depends, which is a great answer. I know you love that answer, Sarah.
I do.
It depends on a number of things related to kind of the construct of the FDA approval and the different CMS rules. So I'm trying to simplify something very complex, but that could be anywhere from 90 days to 6 months based on a number of other factors that we have to take into consideration.
Thank you, Vicki. Emily, how you guys are doing developing your policy? What are you thinking about?
Yeah, we're still in progress as well. And if I could just add maybe some additional comments to Vicki's excellent summary. I mean, the things that I think about are, there you mentioned an outcomes-based agreement. I would love to see an outcomes-based agreement. You know, if I'm being honest, for a drug in this sort of situation where it's the first to market, sometimes I don't even ask like if an outcomes-based agreement is even possible, because so oftentimes the answer is no. But you know, I think that this is a really great reminder that you should ask. You know, you never know. You never know if that manufacturer is willing to, you know, be the first to step out and really take a chance on something that's different. I think another thing that I think about.
And Emily, before you pivot, what would you like to see in an outcomes-based contract with this medicine, given what you know? Would it be showing a reduction in exacerbations, only certain patients? Is there something that comes to mind for how this could be structured in a way that would get your attention?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because when I think about outcomes-based agreements, I think about, you know, how do we make it as simple as possible so it's not a
Right.
burdensome process for everybody? And I guess my initial thought is that maybe there is a way to do that with exacerbations. I would welcome Vicki's thought on this as well. So, but I think that, you know, there's a lot of different creative ways you could go about it. So not saying that that's, you know, the best way, but it is
Not
one.
holding you to it. Just wanted to get like a sense. Vicki, do you want to comment on that real quick? And then I'd love actually Paul, Amy, and John to comment on this point before I let Emily continue. Go ahead, Vicki.
Yeah, you know, it's a good point, and maybe I'll like just zoom it out a little bit more. I think that's one of the things that we don't understand in terms of like the data yet to come is what we would call it medical offset is associated with this medication. So what are the other services that you can ramp down as a result of members being on this medication? And that's something key that we will monitor using our claims data to be able to observe those things, which could then help identify like what is the right outcome of interest from a value perspective. Today, you've all made great analysis through the process to date. We then get the real world evidence of what actually happens when you put this into humans outside of a clinical trial, and you have real human behavior that is probably going to vary somewhat.
Great. Paul, would as a clinician who could be called upon to help adjudicate an outcomes-based contract, this idea of we're going to pay for the drug if it works and if it's showing benefit, can you think of an outcome that you could monitor in your clinic that wouldn't be terribly burdensome that could help us know if this drug is working? No is an okay answer, but I'm just curious how to think about operationalize it.
I think it's really hard, honestly. The main outcome that this trial is that they're studying is exacerbations. Exacerbations are very stochastic, something that's very difficult to deal with on an individual patient level. I mean, I do think that, you know, we don't quite yet know whether I was looking up because of what was going on, that the standard error on the FEV1 change was 12 mLs, which suggests that the standard given that they had 500 patients, suggests that the standard deviation was something like 200 mLs or something. And so, I think, if there's, I think to capture a group of patients that like feels great on it, that you did a survey and their FEV1 is 150 or 200 mLs better in the 6 months, the first 6 months after they take the drug or something, that's a population that, something is working well between their disease or this drug and this drug, or they're getting incredibly lucky, depending on how the size of the population, I suppose. But, I can envision a set of people that might do really well, and you could almost just tell from them telling you, but a standardized symptom form and doing the pulmonary function tests, that like this drug is really agreeing with them.
It's starting to feel harder
don't
to operationalize, right? So go ahead, Paul, please finish.
Well, no,
Yeah.
I don't think the company is going to be happy with that. I suspect single-digit percentage of the population staying on the drug. So I think it would be hard to operationalize, because that's what I would kind of project. Whereas operationalizing, hey, someone has gotten 2 or 3 fewer severe exacerbations over a 5-year span or something, which is kind of what you'd want to see as having an impact on the disease based on what this one is doing. That's going to be awfully hard on an individual patient level or in a reasonable period of time.
Well, one thing, and John, I'm going to look to you for just maybe some body language on this. And so, one option is you could start a little more simply with something that's easy to measure and something that patients don't want to have happen, like ending up in the hospital because they're having an exacerbation. John, fair? That's something you don't want to have happen.
You don't want to have that happen. Well, you don't want to lose your quality of life, whether you express it as a trip to the hospital or a long-term mode of having to sit here and take intravenous antibiotics. And the study specifically excluded NTM as a comorbidity, but in my world, I know that after 2 years of not being on medicines, I'm going to get an infection that's going to cost me 1.5 years. So is it worth it to me? Yeah, I would do anything to keep that 1.5 years available to me. So
Right.
my presentation is a little different than what was studied, but either way, we're looking at preserving the quality of life we have left.
Well, and so Emily, you were very generous that I got to interrupt you and bring us on this little detour about OBCs, but outcomes-based contracts or agreements. But one of the things is potentially sort of a partial refund if a patient ends up in the hospital with an exacerbation, if the point is to reduce the number of exacerbations. So just kind of throwing that out there as we're thinking about novel contracting. Emily, what else are you guys considering and thinking about as you're developing your coverage policy?
Yeah, I think, Sarah, for me, from a prior authorization perspective, I mean, it's my personal opinion that this is a best practice, but typically when it's a first drug to a condition, it takes a little bit longer for our P&T to really feel comfortable assessing the product for this condition, and so that might lead to a little bit longer making our decision and having a policy posted. And so, given that, not just for a situation like this, but in general, my recommendation would be that the drug is available per the FDA label until a policy is posted. If it's not, I don't really feel like it's fair for the patient to have to wait just because it's taking us a little bit longer to make a decision. I think the other thing I think about is that not all prior authorizations are made equal. And so, it's nice because this is a pharmacy benefit product. There's more automation levers that are available on the pharmacy benefit. And so what I think about with this product is attestation, right? Do I really need to see it in the medical record? If a patient has gone through a diagnostic odyssey and their last prescriber who is submitting the prior authorization says, I attest that, all of these things have happened and that they've been done. I mean, to me personally, it feels like that's good enough for me. Can they attest to it in the prior authorization question set that they submit electronically? Those are the things that I think about.
I know there's been an effort to try to streamline, and I know we have ways to go because Paul is probably going to tell us about, or could tell us about, all the people in his clinic who work on paperwork all of the time, and we're not there yet for the burden to be completely gone. But you heard some important things there in terms of a policy or an access policy available with approval that might just be based on the FDA label while a formal policy is developed. Streamlining, attestation, trusting the physician to say, yes, this patient meets all of these criteria. Let's get access to this drug. So those are some best practices. They're in line with a lot of what we have in our fair access criteria, and we'll make sure we highlight those. Paul, I'm going to put you on the spot again. One of the things that I was thinking about, given that we're looking at a drug that reduces the number of exacerbations, and how will we know when to stop it? How do we know it's not working? I think that's something payers and clinicians are going to want to know, and patients are going to want to know. Patients don't want to take a drug that's not working for them, right? I don't think we want to ask anyone to do that. Any thoughts on this, Paul?
I think it's a big problem in the pulmonary space in general. I'm afraid that question is not going to be new to Vicky and Emily. Same question can be asked for many asthma and COPD medications when you're trying to reduce an exacerbation in a disease that is characterized by recurrent exacerbations. Trying to determine whether something isn't working or whether it would be even worse if they weren't on the medication is really, really tricky. The other thing that happens in bronchiectasis that may make it even worse, and John can speak to it directly, but there are bad actors in terms of bugs that when people get colonized with these bugs in bronchiectasis, they are more likely to have more severe exacerbations until you treat those bugs. And those bugs can be the ones that are most problematic, Pseudomonas chief among them, but also NTM. When it's, sometimes it can be a colonizer, but when it's actually infectious, the NTM, or it's the cause, as in John's case, it's a very prolonged and terrible treatment course. And until you treat it, you're going to have recurrent exacerbations. And so, and I don't think there's anything in the mechanism of this drug that is, I guess you could hope that by helping the neutrophils, you help decrease the amount of lung destruction and decrease the amount of lung available for these drugs, these nasty bugs to colonize. But it's not the most compelling thing that this isn't going to happen. So I think even if someone gets pretty demonstrably worse on the drug, if you then culture one of these nasty bugs, it's a pretty easy thing for the patient and clinician to conclude that, like, what has happened is they've gotten colonized with a nasty bug and not that the drug isn't effective. So
yeah. Okay, so complicated. So welcome to pulmonology is the vibe I'm getting, Paul.
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge in all pulmonology, but also a real challenge in medicine that maybe ICER should pay attention to. There are a lot of trials out there about how to escalate therapies, and there are very few trials out there that look very carefully at how to de-escalate therapies. And so we end up very much in real world medicine and whatever. I cover asthma topics. When do you de-escalate biologics? There's very little data on that. I work in the ICU. There's people with acute respiratory distress syndrome. We have like a very high list of things on some of which a lot of trials saying how we escalate people on therapy, trying to take them back off. There's no data at all. So it's a problem in the healthcare space.
Well, and I see Vicky's very positive body language on this, and I'll go to you in a minute, Vicky. But one of the things that I have sort of observed and seen in my role at ICER has given me a deep appreciation for the role of PharmDs. And I'm not saying that just because there's 2 PharmDs on the call. A lot of clinical practices are employing clinical pharmacists to help with this question, the de-prescribing, the drug-drug interactions. And Vicky, I know for your population, this is a big issue. And so please come in on this in terms of like knowing when to stop, whether or not there is too many drugs and maybe not working in concert together for patients. How do you think about this?
Yeah, this is a tremendous issue for patients and payers and everyone in the healthcare system. I spent 10 years in oncology clinical practice as a PharmD at the prescriber's elbow, as you alluded to, Sarah. And like, this is probably one of the hardest things. People want to take a break from therapy. All of this that we just talked about is like getting a break is a real thing that I think people aspire to have. And it is near impossible to get those things studied. And I think that's what we would really need is clinical evidence that shows that this is safe. And you see smatterings of these trials, but they're not certainly none that I'm familiar with in the pulmonology space. You know, we've seen a smattering of them in the oncology space, but there's a host of diseases now that have long-term therapies that we're not necessarily here to talk about today, but would also be very interesting to know when is it okay to stop without experiencing disease regression.
Amy, you've spoken really eloquent today about the ways that we can do better to think about the patient experience when we're doing this. If we wanted to ask a question, if we wanted to study in this therapy, which I know that you've been watching, how to know when it's not working, what outcomes do you think patients would want to see in a study like that? What's mattering to them?
So, I mean, we've asked them questions like this before. They've talked about the exacerbations, being something that they want to deal with. So certainly looking at the problem with the exacerbations, and I just made this point in the chat comments, is that exacerbations can be caused by any number of things. Like something like the weather could trigger it. If you happen to be around somebody who decides they want to wear the most noxious perfume on the planet, that could trigger it. So it's really hard to tell like if that's going to trigger an exacerbation. Having said that, it may not trigger the most severe exacerbation. Honestly, the best way to know is to ask the patients. What we have found is that when we ask patients and we ask them very specific questions worded very specific ways, and that's the science of PROs, right? But when you ask them those kinds of questions, they're willing to answer and they're pretty knowledgeable about this kind of stuff. So those are areas that we may want to dive into in more detail. It seems like it's getting into a little bit into the weeds, but I think it might be a little more helpful in understanding some of the nuance of the disease, of the condition.
Amy, if I could just quickly react to that, if you don't
Yeah.
mind. I see a policy recommendation here. I think that we can acknowledge that there is not a business case for the manufacturers of the medicines to study when the medicine should be stopped. I think we can just all acknowledge that that is not something that they're probably going to invest in. And so maybe this does need to come from the payer purchaser community because there is a real benefit for them understanding and in partnership with patients and patient groups to make sure that we're studying it in a way that reflects what patients actually care about and want from treatment could be one of the policy recommendations that come out of this conversation. And don't worry, y'all don't have to endorse any of our policy
I'm not going to make that
recommendations.
policy. Yeah, I'm not going to make that policy recommendation. But if I'm a manufacturer, um, I'm not sure I want a patient taking a medication if they're not getting a benefit, because if that's part of the post-market data set, then what you're looking at is, oh, you've got a whole set of patients over here who just like, you've got a
Aren't
whole
feeling
data
better.
set showing that,
Yeah.
oh, they're taking it, but it's not doing anything for them. Well, if they're not if that's a subset population that's not going to benefit from that medication, then they shouldn't be prescribed it. So that's obviously something that should be studied.
It should be.
You
I
know,
agree. I just think that sometimes there's financial realities, especially with smaller companies, in terms of where they have resources to invest in some of these types of studies.
yeah, they are not going to necessarily invest in those resources, and I understand that. But yeah, I mean, but that's kind of part of what the post-market data does sort of flesh out in the end anyway.
Help us
I
understand.
personally, from what I'm hearing since the drug's approval, what I've been hearing is that this is not something that they just want to blanket the whole, that prescribers want to blanket the whole world with.
Right.
That they're looking at the patients who were in that population set in the clinical trial as
Yeah.
the main beneficiaries of
Yeah.
this
Yeah. And I
drug.
think that makes a lot of sense. For a new
Yes.
drug in a condition, we kind of match the clinical trial program to know the right patients to at least start it in. And as we get more data
Yeah.
and we have more understanding, and then we can change. And I do want to make a plug. So, one of the ways that we think about de escalating the arms race, as we sometimes call it, which is higher and higher prices, more and more prior auth and access restrictions, more headaches for Paul in his clinic, more calls to Amy's hotline, more people talking about cars when they're really upset, but because they can't get access to their medicine, and John's support groups. Like, we could make different choices. And one of the ways we think the system could be de-escalated is when manufacturers price to the benefit they've been able to prove so far, right? And all the acknowledgments that were early on, payers respond with very little hurdles to getting it, whether it's the prior auth, the cost sharing, any of the other barriers that might exist. And then the medical community has the opportunity to know in front of them which patient to use it in, learn from the patients that are benefiting and not. And then we've got a more seamless experience for access to a new medicine. And so I appreciate you all letting me stand on my soapbox for 30 seconds. We've got about 20 minutes left in our roundtable today, and I want to do two things. One, I want to spend some time, and I think we're kind of segueing there, on the research questions. What are the questions we still need to answer about this medicine, about the treatment available for or future treatment needs for this patient population? And then remember, you're going to get to tell someone to do something. And so start thinking about your final call to action that we'll have in just a couple of minutes. And so, Paul, let me start with you. If you had to write a research agenda for this therapy or this condition, what would be the top of your list for questions you'd want answered?
I think the major thing that I would want to understand is, does this medication have a significant impact on long-term patient outcomes? And it's certainly the entire patient experience, but in particularly, does it truly impact the progression of disease? And so it's really hard both to fund a randomized trial that looks that as many years out as you're talking about, but also it's going to be really difficult in this setting to design a good research plan that gets rid of as much confounding as possible when studying this, because you're going to have, almost inevitably, you're going to have the most motivated patients managing to get themselves onto this medicine. And as John has already described, motivated patients are going to be more likely to be able to do their mucociliary clearance, are going to be motivated to try to follow usual care. And so trying to get rid of that confounding is really hard. I don't know whether you try to look at different places that are making it available at different times, if you compare US and Europe or something, or something like that. But what I want to see is a follow-up over 5 years involving lung function, and maybe number of severe exacerbations would probably be meaning exacerbations that lead to hospitalization or dramatic decline in quality of life. You could work at your definition there, but that's what I'd like to see. But I think it's very challenging you want to design that study so that you take away the confounding that's going to happen from motivated patients that are really doing all of their standard of care correctly, that kind of person being the one that manages to get themselves on this drug. So I think it's a big challenge, but that's what we're going to want. That's a question we need to answer to figure out whether everybody with bronchiectasis should be on one of these agents, or this is
for a subset.
Something useful in our armamentarium, but is hopefully going to be superseded by different things, we hope, because it's not that big a deal.
Amy, one of the things that we learned from the tremendous response from the bronchiectasis community about the lived experience, speaking with you and your team, John and his team, is that a lot of the outcomes that matter most to patients weren't really the focus of the clinical trial. Yes, you care about exacerbations, but you care about fatigue. You care about the quality of life, the ability to travel, the ability to not have to use the pressure vest. So, Amy, fill us in on what would your research agenda look like to make development of drugs in this space more patient-centered?
So I think what we need to be asking is, how are those things tied back to the exacerbations? Because they are inevitably. I mean, like there were so many times where my stepmom couldn't do something because she was having an exacerbation. She couldn't go to, like, I got free tickets to Cirque du Soleil show. Those are like unicorn level events, getting free tickets to something like that. She was good. We were going to go. She had to cancel the day of because she was having an exacerbation. I got into a car accident. Everybody else in the family was out of town. She had to send a family friend to come and see me because she was having an exacerbation and it was raining out. The weather was making it worse. So those are the kinds of things that we need to be asking them about. Like, what are the exacerbations preventing you from doing as well? Those exacerbations that, lead to hospitalizations, lead to worse quality of life, lead to poor lung function. That's kind of it's not one thing isolated. It's part of like an ecosystem of events kind of thing. And getting back to what Paul was saying, his point about, like, should everybody with bronchiectasis take this? Well, I mean, I'm probably gonna, I don't know how well received this is going to be, but no, my dad has bronchiectasis. It's mild, it's stable. He doesn't have any, effects from it. He's had it for decades. It's very mild. He would not be a candidate for this drug. If somebody said, "Oh, I think your dad should be on this drug," I'd be like, "No." And let me show you 10 different doctors who are going to say the same thing. There's no clinical expert who would look at my dad's case and say he should be on this.
Right.
And I don't think that's what's going to happen here either. I don't think that's the case.
Right.
But
Right.
like we keep coming back to, this is the starting point. Yeah, this is the starting point for this, this for where this patient population is going, but it's a really important start. The fatigue is caused by a number of different things. If you have an infection, it causes fatigue. If you are coughing all the time, and this is something we should have learned in the last 5 years, you are fatigued. It's like, if doing airway clearance, like John said, is exhausting. And it is. All of those things, contribute to this fatigue. So is the fatigue important to them? Absolutely. We've asked patients, what are the most bothersome symptoms? And we've heard them say it over and over again. And, year after year, when they've talked about what are the symptoms that, are most prevalent in their mind, that it's the same drumbeat: fatigue, cough, shortness of breath, fatigue, cough, shortness of breath. And I mean, I have the data to back that up directly from patients. So we know that. But, if calming their exacerbations, if calming that inflammation is going to help with the fatigue, if it's going to help with the coughing, which helps with the fatigue, if it's going to help with the shortness of breath because their lungs are not as occluded, because, they're not as, congested, then we've accomplished something that matters to patients. And the patients have been telling us they want something that deals with the exacerbations. They want something that deals with, the inflammation in the lungs. They recognize this as part of that cycle. So yeah, I think
Perfect.
that's where we're headed. But we have to ask the questions very specifically. We have to present it in a way that the patients are, we have to ask the questions specifically, but not in a way where we're leading them to the answer.
Sure.
There's a whole art and science behind that.
Absolutely. John, go ahead.
Some excellent comments so far. And to Amy's point on the socializing, yeah, there are a lot of social events that I have planned in an afternoon and I just don't go because by then I'm exhausted kind of thing. So yes, it is part of our life. I'd like to talk about cost a little bit because we keep talking about cost as individual items. The cost of this medicine is X dollars per year. And I brought up the subject of respiratory therapists. It's a cost of X dollars per year. When we look at how the oscillating vest is prescribed, to get an oscillating vest for a patient in our group, you have to show a 6-month history that you've been doing airway clearance and that wasn't sufficient before it's justified. And I get that because it's a big ticket item. I would propose that this medicine can be used in that same mindset. Almost think of this medicine as a penalty shot, that when you don't make progress doing the things you're supposed to be doing, then this could be introduced as an extra cost item, not introduced in the very beginning. But the other part of that is we have to be diligent about it, that patients can come in and say, yeah, I do my airway clearance. Nobody ever holds me accountable to this. And I have complained about that. I would prefer that when I come into the doctor's office, that somebody does quiz me and kind of make sure that I'm really doing the task, that give me a log to fill out that says, I've done my airway clearance in the morning for so many minutes. I did it in the afternoon. Make me bring that to the appointment. When I bring that 6 months in a row and I'm still suffering, maybe then I've earned a high ticket medicine rather than just doling it out to everybody that comes in. But then everybody's invested in the system and we've given the payers a reason to invest in those respiratory therapists because that's significantly less expensive than this medicine.
Incredibly thoughtful, John. Thank you. And it does dovetail beautifully with what Amy was talking about in terms of like the community is not out of the gate saying, please prescribe this to everyone. You want to know exactly the right patients to prescribe this for whom's going to have the most likely benefit. That's fantastic. Paul, go ahead.
First of all, John, I really like that idea a lot. I think one thing that's interesting about the idea is, as you got a hint of in this trial, I do think motivating people to do good mucociliary clearance probably has a stronger effect on this disease in many patients than this drug has been proven to have. And so you're sort of doing an interesting kind of backdoor optimization. And I agree, if it motivates payers to pay for respiratory therapists or additional ways of encouragement and monitoring to try to demonstrate the benefit of usual care and get people feeling better, that way through mucociliary clearance, I think that's really good. I think one thing I left out of the post marketing that I want.
Yeah, your research agenda. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, for research agenda that touch on something Amy said made me think of it. Is I did want to note that, like with all research, there's confidence intervals around what happened. And I sort of mentioned this in the meeting, that what happened for the population in the trial, so people that had 2 exacerbations in the previous year before they started and had a pretty reasonable bronchiectasis burden, is that they had an absolute decrease in risk of around 8% of their chance of exacerbation in the following year. But the confidence interval around that is about 3 to 18%. I could multiply it out, but it's something like that. And if the truth is that it's a 3% reduction, this medicine is not that amount of reduction, even trying to compound it over time and seeing how much an individual exacerbation might help people, it's going to be hard to see that impact going forward. If it's an 18% reduction, that just by, even if it doesn't do anything specifically for the disease in any other way, having people have an absolute decrease of 20%, 18-20% of getting an exacerbation, and the good effects of not having that many exacerbations in a year, you're going to be able to see that and people are going to be able to survey it, and you should be able to see that in the post-marketing. So one of the even simpler things that the post-marketing data should be doing is, in the real world, like, are we closer to 3, or are we closer to 18, or are we right in the middle, wherever the trial said, is going to be a really important question to determine, how big of a blockbuster this therapy is, how many people it can help.
Yeah. Amy, 30 seconds to add to research agenda before I go to Vicky and Emily.
Yeah, I just want to touch on something Paul had mentioned earlier about like clinical trial design. One of the things that has come up, and we've had a number of clinical trial sponsors approach us to discuss study design as they were entering the space. One of the things we've always advocated is that every patient should be doing airway clearance. And they ask us, what's the best airway clearance? And our answer is the best airway clearance for a patient is the one they're going to do. There's multiple ways to do airway clearance, but so we don't advocate them standardizing a particular method, but the patient in any clinical trial should be doing airway clearance. That we always say that should be a standard part, because then you have at least some standardization. They are doing, pulmonary hygiene. It's still an important part of the ritual for this patient group. So, at least having that as part of the, that has some standardization across it. So we always do recommend that regardless.
Great. Vicky, what do you want on the research agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all saying something similar here, but I'll say it slightly differently. To level set, today as a Medicare payer, we're very limited in our ability to require any non-pharmacological requirements, in addition to the wraparound services that we're all talking about. So our ability to have that criteria approved is not possible. But I would really love some healthcare services research around what is the holistic model for for patients who are taking this drug. Like, what is the best way to get them to do airway clearance in addition to the drug? Is that in different groups of, like, how do you motivate patients for those wraparound services? This demo idea of how to provide the care is always really fascinating for these disease states where you're trying to figure out what are the other components of care and how do we incentivize those.
Vicky, to make sure I understand the point, you're not allowed to have a coverage policy that requires something that's not in the pharmacy benefit to be done before you can get access to the pharmaceutical?
Yeah, so I would, John's idea was a cool one, but I wouldn't be able to get that approved through CMS. So, like, all of our prior authorization criteria needs to be approved, and that would not pass that process.
Because the CMS guidelines say the sort of prior auth criteria have to be sort of within the pharmacy benefit. Like you could require trying a different drug, not for this, if it was a different disease. Okay, thank you, Vicky. Very helpful. Emily, research agenda.
I mean, it's been covered so well, but if I could answer your question slightly differently, Sarah, I would love a US clinical practice guideline. I think that really helps. It would be so good for all of us. So just good for that.
I'll tell your friends.
Ditto. I almost picked that one.
Yeah. All right, time.
I do my little part with up to date, but it's not quite a full clinical practice guideline.
All right, that is a good plug for the value of up to date. Thank you for that. We're going to go round robin. Final call to action, something you'd like to see done in the ecosystem that gets us to a more affordable access paradigm for this new medicine, for all of the treatments for bronchiectasis. You can take it bolder. I was lecturing everyone this morning about we got to think big about how to fix affordability here. So you can go bigger than that if you'd like. And Emily, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, Sarah, really quickly, I'd just love to thank the patient experts and the patient advocates for helping me understand the lived experience. It's been super helpful for me, but I would just encourage the manufacturer to, be brave, be creative, use, just be a leader in the industry and use all of the different possible options that are available to help make this medication more affordable.
Thank you, Emily. Vicky.
Yeah, I was going to thank our patient advocates and patients themselves who are here today. It's been hugely helpful. And as I think about that, I would love to find a way to have an ongoing dialogue around these lived experiences and those pain points, because we're very committed to figuring out how to ensure that the patients have what they need to be successful in their disease. This is incredibly difficult to navigate. I think that's the bottom line here. And the more we hear directly from patients, we can solve the real problems that you have using the platform that we have.
Thanks, Vicki. Paul.
I would echo, really appreciate patients and patient representatives coming and speaking on this. I don't know, you're asking me to go really big. I mean, I think kind of what you were talking about. I mean, I think if we could, advocate for changing the model here to where pricing is somehow proportional to the benefit that you can demonstrate, it would be really nice in terms of it, getting companies to continue to fund it. Again, like I said, it's be so difficult. It's going to be so difficult with post-marketing to figure out exactly how good this drug is unless it's really, 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 really good. And, it would be anyway, it'd be a nice change to the ecosystem to try to have there be more proportionality between benefits demonstrated with data and what the pricing model of a drug could be. I love that idea. I don't know how to make it happen, but
we're trying. So we'll keep talking. All right, Amy. Final call to action.
Yeah, so I actually I appreciate what Vicki was saying about, having more patient input into what their needs are, and having more direct dialogue. I think that a lot of us really haven't known how to make that happen. And the patient advocacy groups are always happy to have a dialogue with everybody. Our patients are certainly happy to tell you what they think. I can tell you that right now. If you ask them to tell you what they want and what they think, they will tell you. As you saw from the comments that were submitted on the ICER website, they are not shy. And they're, they shouldn't be. That's how they get what they need and what they want. But I think that's an important conversation to continue to have, because there are certain things that our patients use regularly and need regularly that they have a lot of trouble getting coverage for, that are part of the, as you mentioned, the holistic care of the patient. And I think that should be looked at more carefully.
Thank you. John, you get the final word.
Woo. Okay, well, I already snuck in my prayer for respiratory therapists, so that doesn't count. And I've given you my lecture on accountability. I understand Vicki's point that she can't go there, but it doesn't mean we as a group can't go there. So it's back to you then, Paul, and the people you hang out with. How do we incorporate patient accountability into standard of care that don't take us at our word? We ought to be held at a higher level. I had medicines where I had to bring in the pill bottle every month and they counted out my pills. So I know it can be done, but we will do a better job if we know somebody is keeping an eye on us. And it goes back to that thing of only an optimist does airway clearance. So I'd leave it at that. And thank you everyone for being part of it.
Thank you. My deep gratitude to this exceptional panel. And one of my reflections is that tiptoeing carefully into this comment, it's a tough time to be focused on evidence-based medicine. I mean, we've got a lot going on in our system that is challenging how we talk about evidence, how we talk about patients, how we talk about access to care. And this conversation has left me so optimistic about the opportunities we have to still show up, have hard conversations, respectfully disagree at times, but think about solutions that at the end of the day will get us to more affordable access. So my thanks to this entire roundtable for their exceptional contributions. And with that, I get to invite back onto the screen Ralph and the rest of the CTAF for some final reflections. Over to you, Ralph.
Thanks, Sarah. That was a very informative roundtable. Thank you, everyone, for participating. We are now ready to give our CTAF reflections. I hope everyone is on the camera as we speak. And to start off, I'm going to ask Felicia Cohn.
Oh, not sure I'm ready to go first.
Oh.
Breathing is so priceless. I'm not sure this drug is. Big promises. And in ethics, I always worry about the creation of false hope. So I hope we can get past that to build on the promise that this medication offers and see where else we can go with it.
Thank you. Bob, notice you weren't number one.
I appreciate that, Ralph. I really do. I'm going to suggest reverse order sooner or later, but we'll see. I'd like to give everybody a pat on the back in several different ways. I appreciate finally getting to get my vibrating with anticipation out before the roundtable today. And I would just like to add my thanks to everybody. This has been a more productive meeting to me than I thought it was going to be, which is more unusual than you might think. I'd also like to do something completely off-centered in a slightly different way, and I'm really looking forward to Jeffrey's. I hope he's got a haiku for me or something. But I would like to thank everybody for helping inform a conversation that you're unaware of. My wife is going to be at the National Academy of Medicine next week on Monday, talking about, for an extended period of time compared to everybody else, person-centered clinical research. And I cannot tell you, I hope all of you are as shocked as we were to actually really understand the depth of what a medical term that actually is. And it is not the same as patient-centered. So if you want to talk about somebody's going to be pissed off about somebody else, we're going to be on that team next week. I appreciate all of you, and this discussion has been very informative for what's going to take place with that. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob, for being the person you are. Paul Heidenreich.
Yeah, I'll say I was struck by, I think in many ways, the strength of the evidence that was presented, but also clear, I think clear evidence that it's a small benefit and it justifies a price, but nowhere near what's being requested.
Thanks, Paul. Jeffrey Hodge.
Thank you. A good new option that just costs too much right now. Please lower the price. Is my haiku for today.
Love those haikus. Jeff.
Yeah, no haiku, but I just, pricing is a manufacturer's decision. It has very little relationship to what it takes to bring a drug to market. It's, they basically price it what they think that the market will bear. And the problem is we all know that this is going to reduce access for patients. There will be more hurdles that doctors have to jump through to give it. We heard from Dr. Axamit that, perhaps if this was given earlier, it may help more. We have all that hope. And I guarantee you that the price that's there, it's going to be a very restricted group that's going to be able to get it. So this is a poor decision from a public health and access standpoint. This is going to harm patients. And so my plea is I wonder if our, brilliant patient advocate groups, which is a very thoughtful group today, has any ability to, get back to the manufacturer and say, you've made a decision that's going to harm our patients, because it really has. I guarantee you that any payer is going to make people jump through considerable hoops in order to get this drug. And it's going to, it's going to harm people, because we agree it is helpful, but it's only helpful if you can get it.
Thanks, Jeff. Say.
Yeah, I think I don't have much more to add. I guess the one thing that I would say is in terms of this question about knowing when to stop medicines, I would just say that certainly in the world of geriatrics, deprescribing and deprescribing research is a thing. And there's a deprescribing research network. It's in a slightly different context of patients who are getting much older and more frail. But I think that concept is definitely something that we need to really focus on. And our current way of funding research, which is generally for-profit entities that have an ultimate profit motive, is not going to, are actively incentivized against funding this sort of research. So we need to actually think about how do we go about figuring out when we can safely stop these medicines. And then I'll go with kind of, again, the role of the manufacturer here. I mean, clearly in our society, money is power. And so I will channel Spider-Man and say that with great power comes great responsibility. And these manufacturers have not shown the responsibility that the power that they have suggests that they need to.
Say you just created the line of the meeting, by the way. Catherine.
Yeah, it's hard to follow, say. So I really appreciate becoming informed about this disease. I didn't know much about it. And the term that really sticks to me is a vicious vortex. What a great term. That's what it is, and it's hard. So we have tough decisions to be made, but I really feel for the patients who are in the middle of this vicious vortex.
Sometimes I think the world right now is also in a vicious vortex. Tony.
Yeah, thank you, Ralph. Indeed, a very good meeting. We heard a few times earlier today that this assessment has been somewhat more clear-cut, linear than many of our other ones. I sort of agreed with that, but actually listening to the policy roundtable over the last hour, I can see that the case is not nearly as simple as we might have thought. Simple or not, it is good news that we have a new treatment, which is showing some signs of being a helpful option, albeit as an add-on. Perhaps last but not least, I am concerned that the big gap between the manufacturer's announced price and ICER's value assessment is going to limit patients' access to this drug, while the manufacturer, the payers, and the patients go back and forth as to who should pay and who should not pay. Hopefully this gap can be bridged soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. My final comments is that the bronchiectasis community now has some hope about a new class of drugs for the treatment of NCFB, heralded by brensocatib. And I really do want to thank all my CTAF members, the clinical experts, the incredible roundtable today run by Sarah, and in particular, thank the patients and the patients' advocates, which really gave us today a really rich discussion on NCFB. And with that, I'm going to close the meeting. Do you have any further comments, Sarah?
I do. Before we bring up the final slide, not quite yet, we have one final order of business, which is to ask everyone who's still here on the call to give Ralph a very big round of applause, because this is the last meeting Ralph is chairing as the CTAF chair. And he has done an exceptional job carrying that mantle. We are so grateful for your commitment to evidence-based medicine, to what we're trying to accomplish at ICER, for your years of being part of the family. Ralph, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
All right, one final slide before we let everyone go today, just so you know where we're headed. So we will be writing up all of the wonderful things that we talked about today with the suite of policy recommendations that will be part of the final report, which will be published on or around October 27th. The meeting recording should be online next week for those who want to revisit any part of the meeting. All of the materials are available the ICER website under the assessment section. My deep thanks to everyone for their attention and their engagement today. One last thank you to Ralph for his leadership as CTAF chair. And Mr. Chair, would you like to officially adjourn today's meeting?
I have hit the gavel. This meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everyone.
Hurrah.